Hey, it's Art. Welcome back to the channel. Effects, sends and returns, or auxiliary sends and returns are super valuable parts of modern music mixers, affording us independent control over our dry, unprocessed tracks or original tracks, and our wet, affected tracks and our effects, versus having our effects directly inserted on our original tracks. They are super useful for time-based effects like reverb and delay, and can also be used for parallel processing like parallel compression, parallel saturation, and distortion. If you haven't been utilizing effects, sends, and returns in your mixes, I would highly encourage you to do so. And in this video, I want to share a variety of different strategies we can utilize to get the most out of our effects, sends, and returns in the most creative ways possible. So without further ado, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started. All right, here we are inside the digital audio workstation. And before we get into it, I quickly want to go over what effects, sends, and returns actually are. So you can see here that in this example, I have my drums selected, and we go to this send right here. You can see that I'm sending the vast majority of the drums to bus 11. I'm not sending the overheads. You can see in this potentiometer that there's no level being sent, nor am I sending any of the hi-hats, but all of the shells and a little bit of the room I'm sending to bus 11. Then the snares over here, these three, I'm sending also to bus 12 and to bus 21. Now, this is different than the output right here, where all of these drums are being bused to bus 1. If we look right here, I have the drum subgroup, which has its input as bus 1. So that is a subgroup, not a send. So I'm sending, again, these drums to bus 11. And if we scroll over here, we have bus 11 coming in right here on this drum effects return or parallel channel. And then I said bus 12 for the snares. This is a snare plate effects return. So I have a little plate right here from Sound Toys, which acts as a reverb that is affecting only the snares because only the snares are being sent to it. And then over here on 21, I have extra reverb for these snares, just the Space Designer stock convolution reverb from Logic. And so in addition to all of these drum tracks being outputted to bus 1, their respective drum subgroup, they're also having their audio sent to these other return channels over here. And then these return channels are being sent to bus 33, as is the drum subgroup right here. And bus 33 is our mix bus right here. So I hope that that all makes sense. I'm kind of working from a point of reference where you already understand how effects sends work or how auxiliary tracks work. If you do want more information, I have a video going in depth about routing inside mixers, particularly in Logic Pro, but it does apply to all digital audio workstations. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below and a card up top. And so with that, let's get into the bulk of this video, which is talking about creative ways to utilize our effects, sends, and returns. So as we may already know, effects returns are commonly utilized for time-based effects, that is delay or reverb, as a way to give us independent control again over the original signal and the delayed or reverberant version of that signal. And one strategy we can utilize to get a little bit more sonic interest is to utilize, especially on mono sources, opposite side or same side delay or reverb. So in this case, I have two guitars, or this band in this mix has two guitars. And what I did was I set up opposite side reverbs in this case. So if we open up these two Space Designers, I just have a simple spring reverb on either of these. And you can see that I have them labeled guitar VL or guitar verb left and guitar VR, so guitar verb right. And these are being fed by bus 15 and bus 16 respectively. So I'll close these quickly and then go over to the guitars. And you see that guitar 1 is panned to the left-hand side. That is being sent to bus 16. Again, 16 is panned all the way right. And then the other guitar, guitar 2, which is panned to the right, is being sent to the reverb that is panned left. And so this opposite style reverb or delay, depending on what you want to use, is a great way to add a little bit more dimensionality and a bit more width to our mono sources. So if I was to solo this guitar 1, for instance, we would hear guitar 1 on the left-hand side, and then its reverb will be on the right-hand side. I would strongly suggest listening to this tutorial in headphones so that you can get the full effect here. I'll turn up the verb. And then we can also have a listen to the other side. So guitar 2, pan to the right, and its reverb is going to be to the left. Alternatively, we can also utilize same side, just to kind of more firmly position that, in this case, guitar in its position. We can do the same over here, actually, with guitar 1. versus opposite side. So in this case, it's very subtle. I'm not driving this reverb all that hot in the mix. But again, for mono sources that are feeding these effects returns, utilizing opposite side delay or reverb is a great way to get more dimension or more width out of the track, while same side, and particularly the same exact panning position, is a great way to really solidify that instrument's position in the stereo panorama of the mix. So you saw in that example that I was messing about with the actual fader levels of the return channels themselves. That is a major advantage of actually utilizing these, is that we have independent control over the reverbs versus the dry channels over here. We can even set our sends so that they are being sent post-pan or post-fader or pre-fader, so that the fader right here has no bearing on the amount of signal that is being sent to these effects returns. And so that's something else I would like to talk about, is if we, for example, turned both of these into pre-fader, and let's actually send them at unity, we now have a situation where regardless of how much signal is being actually outputted from these channels, the amount that's being sent to the reverbs is going to be the same. So if I brought these reverbs back up and even more so that we can really hear them, I can show you a cool effect where I'll bring the guitars down and their reverbs will remain at the same level. So this is a cool effect that you can utilize to fade the dry signals in and out while still maintaining the effects returns that they are sent to. Here's an example. So we have no more dry signal, only the reverberant signal. Now I can bring the dry back in. So pay attention and have some fun with pre or post fader sends and use them to your advantage in the mix. Now, while we're on the level of send levels, I should mention here that we can send multiple tracks to a single effects return and have each of those tracks at a different level. And you can see that here in the drums. I have all of the shells being sent at unity. Then I wanted to send a little bit of the room mic right here to the parallel channel. And so I have the room being sent post fader at -13, and everything else is being sent at 0 or unity. So that is something else to keep in mind in order to get the most out of your effects returns. The next strategy worth considering to get more out of our effects returns is to actually EQ them. So we typically think of effects returns as having independent control over an effect like, say, reverb or delay. But we sometimes miss the fact that we can process these with other effects and not just the intended effect. And so, for example, I have the snare drum being sent to that plate reverb I was talking about. And if we go over to the plate reverb bus 12, I have, again, this little plate from Sound Toys. And then I also have a channel EQ right here. And this channel EQ is taking out about 10 dB, which is quite a drastic cut at about 400 hertz. That's just to reduce some of that muddiness of the reverb. Reverb often has the tendency to wash things out in the mix and cause a lot of smearing of certain frequencies and a lot of masking of certain frequencies. And the low mids right here, I'd say from about 80 to 500, are really sensitive to such frequency masking. This is often what we refer to as the muddiness range. And so if we can cut that from a lot of our reverbs, a lot of our delays, independently of the tracks that are feeding them, then we can have that much cleaner of a mix. So this is going to be subtle, but if I was to solo the snares and the snare reverb, I can toggle this EQ on and off. We can have a listen to how it cleans up. So it sounds a little bit less boomy by itself, and then in the context of the mix,
the sounds you make when you're lying inside of me feels so right. Why can't
mixing is largely a game of inches. It's not making a huge obvious difference right here, nor would I really want it to, but it does, in addition to everything else I've done in the mix, help to clean up the overall sound of the snare and the frequency masking within the mix. As an additional point for time-based effects, I would typically recommend utilizing a minimum phase style EQ like this one. I find that they sound a bit more natural versus if we are doing parallel processing like this drum parallel compression, for example, I would recommend utilizing a linear phase EQ, which doesn't introduce the typical phase shifts that a normal EQ would. And that is because we are duplicating taking the signal and then processing them in parallel, versus in the case of time-based effects, we have a dry signal and then a signal that already has a bunch of phase shift or timing shift in it. And so we aren't going to have that strange phase cancellation, and we'll get a more natural sound out of this EQ versus, again, the parallel style processing. We want as much of the phase to match up between the dry and the wet signal because we are going to be mixing them together. We don't want that phase cancellation, even though a linear phase EQ may not sound as natural by itself as a minimum phase. I do plan on going deeper into linear phase EQ and how it's different than all the other EQs in a future episode. I will link that in the description box down below whenever it becomes available. All right, moving on. Another way to get more out of our effects returns is to do what I call dynamic reverb or dynamic delay. So if we are using a time-based effect like reverb or delay, and we have a strong dry signal that is driving it, we again don't want too much washout, particularly of the transients. And so one way to make sure that the original dry signal punches through while still maintaining that sense of dimension from the delay or reverb is to sidechain compress the effects return, the reverb or delay, with the dry signal so that it gets ducked out of the way whenever the dry signal is present, and then it's allowed to swell up when the dry signal is not present. This is very useful for things like vocals where there's a lot of pauses between different phrases. So while the vocal in this example is performing, the effect will be subdued, and then between the vocal lines, that effect will be able to swell up and give us that sense again of dimensionality. So the lead vocal right here as an example is being sent to bus 13 and 14 at lower amounts. 13 over here is a stereo delay, 14 is another delay in mono, and then bus 20 right here is a reverb. So I find that this dynamic style processing is especially important on reverbs because reverbs tend to wash things out a little bit more. So if we go over to this Vox verb, we see that it is being fed by bus 20, again, bus 20 being sent from the lead vocal. We have this little plate once again, a little bit of EQ to brighten things up, and then this compressor right here, which is being sidechained by audio 18, which is the lead vocal. So now if I solo the vocal, we can have a listen and a look to what it's doing to this vocal reverb right here.
And you see me live, you saw.
So we're getting about 8 dB of gain reduction right here when the vocal is present. And then you saw that this compressor is going back to 0, so no gain reduction. And it's allowing this reverb to swell up between the vocals, or between the vocal lines, I should say. So again, this is a great way to push the reverb out of the way to allow the vocal to really punch through the mix. And then when the vocal is not present, to still have that reverb be present to give that sense of dimensionality. And while we are on the topic of sidechains and dynamic processing, we can also utilize noise gates. So right here, I actually didn't use this in the mix, but I'll use this mix as an example. On the snare plate that we talked about, we again have this little plate followed by this channel EQ. And then I have this gate right here, just the stock noise gate from Logic. And if we go over here, once again, solo these snares, which are being sent to bus 12 right here, we can sidechain this noise gate to open up when the snare sample is being triggered. And so I chose the snare sample because it's the cleanest. There's a lot of bleed going on in the snare top and the snare bottom that may mistrigger the noise gate, but the snare sample is only happening when the actual snare hits are happening. So if I was to loop these 4 bars, let's say, every time the snare sample is triggered, it's going to open this gate, and it's actually going to be held open for almost half a second, and then it's going to be released. And so we can have a listen to the snare plate reverb with this noise gate being triggered by the snare sample. You can see open and closed, open, closed, open. And I time that out so that it closes as the 1 happens and it opens, generally speaking, on the 2 when that snare happens. I can reduce the release if I wanted to and bring up the hold so that it's more abrupt. And if I turn the noise gate off, then the reverb would just continue tailing out. With the gate. This process is also known as gated reverb. I do have a video going into more detail about that. I'll leave it in the description box down below as well. But just another way of utilizing dynamics processing along with our time-based effects on our effects returns to get more interesting results. In the case of gated reverb, we can often get a much larger burst of energy and then not have that just tail out and consume or mask the other frequencies in the mix. So we've spent quite a bit of time on reverb. Let's change our focus here to more parallel style processing, and particularly to the saxophone solo in the case of this mix. So I'll just loop this out. And if we go to the sax solo track right here, you can see that we are sending to that 13 and 14, which are a stereo and a mono delay respectively. And then we have a parallel sax channel right here on bus 23, and then also some reverb. So if we pay special attention to bus 23, I'll actually mute the send to bus 24 for the time being. We can scroll over here and see that bus 23 is being sent to a doubler first and foremost, then a micro shift. These are just to help widen out the effect. And then we have the decapitator with the drive maxed out, just to give a lot of grit, a lot of distortion to the sax. So the saxophone by itself sounds like this. It sounds great on its own, but with the saturation right here, the parallel saturation, I just wanted to dirty it up a little bit. You can see that I have this mixed relatively low, but then with it, just a little bit more grit. I'll play it without and with. So it just gives it a bit more grit. And because I'm applying this doubler effect right here, it's also giving it a bit more width in the mix. So we still have a very strong center image from the actual dry track itself right here. And then additionally, we have this extra tone from the decapitator. So I suppose I could break this down into two separate techniques. The first of which is actually doubling our effects returns. This is a great way to get more width from a signal. In here, that is bringing out some width. And then additionally, I have this micro shift to add more width. And so here's an important point I should mention, is that the doubler effect right here, I could actually achieve that on the dry signal itself by simply bringing the doubler over and just ensuring that I maintain this center image. So keeping the direct signal right here. So then what's really the point of sending it to an effects return if I just want this doubling effect? Well, because I can, in this case, add in the micro shift immediately after it and only have this micro shift act on the effects return rather than having it affect the dry signal as well. So these are all things to consider. We can utilize the dry mix control. In this case, we can utilize having 3 different channels to actually get the first effect on the track itself by simply inserting it on the original channel. However, if we want to combine different effects, which we're going to dive into deeper later, then setting up an effects return like this is the way to do it. So I'm going to get rid of it and focus again more here on the effects return. So in addition to the doubling, I put another effect on top of that. And again, this is only affecting the effects return. So we maintain the original signal coming out of this track, the original sax solo that was recorded. In the context of the mix, I can turn this on and off. Without. With. Then if I bring in the plate and the mono delay and the stereo delay, it sounds like this. You can see here that I'm sending also the sax saturation channel to the same stereo delay as the original sax solo right here. If I turn all of these back on, this is being sent to bus 13, as is the effects return right here. So there's a whole bunch of different intricacies that we can utilize when routing into and out of our effects returns. Again, we're going to touch on more advanced concepts like this in a moment, but I just wanted to share that as we move through this video. Now, one other effect I want to share with this sax solo, I'm actually going to change things up a little bit and talk about mid-side processing. So let's get rid of these stereo options right here so that we only have basically a mono track. The left and the right channels are going to be exactly the same. So once again, we have the sax solo. And then we can make this stereo by utilizing mid-side processing. So if you're familiar with the mid-side microphone technique, it's when we have a cardioid or unidirectional microphone pointed toward the sound source, and then we have a bidirectional or figure-8 microphone pointed to the sides of the sound source. And what we do in the mix is we take that bidirectional microphone signal, we duplicate it, we flip the phase of one of them, and then we pan those to the hard left and hard right. And so in stereo, we get this nice wide image because we effectively have maximum phase differences between that particular duplicated mic channel. And then when we sum them to mono, those two channels completely phase cancel each other out. And so we're left with a very strong center image when we do sum to mono. So we can achieve the same thing here with an effects return by, again, taking this pseudo stereo channel, which is actually mono, phase inverting the right so that we have something that is completely out of phase. When we listen to it in stereo, it sounds nice and wide. And then when we collapse to mono, it's going to completely cancel out. And so what I'm going to do is go to this mix bus. I'm going to put in a metering plugin right here, the correlation meter. So if we have absolute phase cohesion, we are going to be at +1. And if we have the left and right channels completely out of phase, we're going to be at -1. Then I'm also going to add in another gain right here so that I can toggle the entire mix. I'm going to put this one down here into mono or have it in stereo. If we were to add a little bit of reverb, for example, something with some time and some phase differences, I'll just open up this chroma verb, for example, and then actually make sure that this is truly in mono. Now we can invert it. I'll bring this sax solo back, the dry signal. And so we're getting some stereo information out of this channel right here. Now, if I was to flip this phase back, we would have something completely in mono. Flip it. Some stereo information. But now if I was to go to the actual mix bus and toggle this mono switch so that we switch from a stereo mix to a mono mix, we would lose that reverb entirely because by itself, the effects return is completely out of phase. You can see that right here. So summing this to mono completely cancels it out. If I bring in the sax, so the mix is in mono. If I open this up to stereo, we get that stereo effect, that mid-side effect. We can get rid of it completely by summing the entirety of the mix to mono. The context of the greater mix. Opening the mix to stereo. So that's something cool that we can utilize our effects returns for, is to get that mid-side processing that completely eliminates itself if we ever have to sum our mix to mono, or if the mix is ever played back on a mono playback system. Mono compatibility is a very important part of mixing. I actually have a video going into detail about that. I'll leave a link to that one in the description box down below if you're interested in watching that one as well. So that is mid-side processing that we can get away with our effects returns. Now the mix bus is returned to its stereo output, and let's have a look at effects throws, which is one of my favorite ways to utilize effects returns, and particularly on vocals. So if we go to the bridge right here, we have the lead vocal, and if I open up my automation lanes, you can see that the send to bus 25, or the vocal delay throw, which is right here, is actually being muted for most of the mix, and then it's being open or thrown to that effects return. Then it's closed off, then it's thrown again, closed off, and then thrown one last time. So vocal throws are a great way to accentuate different parts of the vocal in this case, but you can utilize it for any track that you would like. And then additionally, on top of that, I want to mention that we can always automate our effects returns, whether we're throwing to them or if they are ever present in the mix. And so in this case, I have the Echo Boy, a decapitator right here, which is being automated. And this is what this sounds like. I'm going to solo out the vocal just so that we can really hear it. So you can see if you focus on bus 25 right here, that this is going to open up and then close. And that is being sent to bus 25. Bus 25 is in right here, again, to that Echo Boy and decapitator and gain. And to make things even more obvious, I do have some volume automation that I actually used in the mix, but I'm just going to crank this up so that you get the maximum effect of what's going on.
Oh, you're throwing me out, oh, you're begging me please, and I wouldn't even doubt it, but tomorrow you'll be down on your knees, doubting why you
So you saw that over the course of these few bars, the drive on the Sound Toys Decapitator went from 0 up to 10. And then you also saw here that I was throwing at these different parts of the vocal just to accentuate them more in the mix. So this is just one example of vocal throws or effects throws more generally. And there's so much that you can do with vocal throws. I would encourage you to get creative and try these on your own time. I do have a video going into more detail about vocal throws in particular. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below and a card up top if you're interested in checking that out. And that's all I have for you in this mix. I quickly want to jump to one other mix before we get into more of a production session. All right, here we are in the next session. This is a production session for a track I worked on by Luki called Otium. And speaking of automation in our effects returns, you can see that I have a bit of volume automation going on in each of these 3 effects returns, each of which is a shimmer type effect, which is what I want to talk about in this section. So a shimmer type effect is a delay or a reverb that has pitch shifting, typically by an octave incorporated into it. And so I have these 2 muted just for the time being, and I have this first shimmer. This is on bus 25, and you can see that both of these bass tracks are being sent to bus 25. So the inserts on this actual effects return go as follows. We first have the pitch shifter. This is just the stock one in Logic Pro, followed by a space designer with an old vintage reverb 2.5 seconds. This, again, the space designer is the convolution stock in Logic Pro. And then I have a bit of EQ just to roll off the very low end of the bass guitar because I didn't want to muddy it up too much, especially when I'm stacking multiple shimmer effects on top of one another. So without the shimmer or without the pitch shifting up an octave, we have this. It's a very subtle reverb. Then with the shimmer or with the pitch effect, again, up by an octave or 12 semitones. Just adds a little bit of extra shimmer or top end brilliance to the sound. I really like utilizing shimmer type effects, especially as a guitarist. There's a lot of pedals that offer this shimmer type reverb or shimmer type delay. And then as a sort of preview into what we are going to get into in the following session, I have this shimmer reverb then being sent itself to bus 26 and bus 27. So 26 right here is an additional shimmer layer. This is a delay. So again, I have this pitch shift where we are going up another 12 semitones or another octave on top of what we already did here. And then I have the EQ, and then I have this stereo delay. So I have a quarter note on the left, an eighth note on the right. So bringing this into the mix, this is what this sounds like. You can see that there's a lot of automation. And then on top of sending it to this additional layer of shimmer, I have it sent to bus 27. And bus 27 doesn't actually have an additional pitch shifting effect, but it does have a chorus and a tremolo, just to add a little bit more movement to this reverb right here. A little bit of movement there, and then here's the delay on top of it. These are both based off of what is being outputted by this original shimmer, which itself is based off of the bass guitars. Without any shimmer effects. And with them. It's a very cool effect to add as you will to your own music. All right, now let's hop into the next session and really have some fun with effects returns. All right, here we are inside of our fun session to experiment a little bit more with effects returns and what we can get out of them, just to help spark some ideas for you to utilize effects returns to your fullest. And so I'm going to go through a few different techniques here and a few different uses of effects returns. Really, the potential is limitless here, but I just want to show you some neat things that I put together in order to help you with your effects returns and your experimentation. So the first thing I want to touch on is an octaver effect. So this is a guitar loop that I had recorded that is being sent to bus 7, and then bus 7 just has this pitch shifter that is going down 12 semitones or an octave. And so this sounds like so. And the key here is that I am adding distortion to this pitch down an octave. So by itself, the guitar sounds like this, with the pitch shifting. But then I'm distorting the pitched down version. And now you may be asking yourself, why don't I just utilize the pitch shifter with this mix control, mix it on the actual direct original track right here at about 50%, and then distort it? And the reason is that setting it up that way would require the decapitator or the distortion to also distort the original signal. So we can actually have a listen to the difference here. So what I have here is the pitch shifter, of course, going into this decapitator, and we just heard what that sounds like. Now, if I was to mute the Octaver effect, open up this pitch shift and mix it at 50, you can see right here. And then I'm going to apply gain right here to add 60 dB or double the volume of this track because we, again, are losing this effect return. And then apply that same exact decapitator with the same exact settings. As you can see here, they are identical, would sound like this. Pretty gnarly. And now again, if I was to get rid of all that, send it to the Octaver and only distort the lower octave, it sounds like this. So a completely different tone with the same exact effects just by utilizing an effects return like this. And it doesn't just have to be distortion, it could be any style effect. We could have a look at, I don't know, maybe ring mod. If I was to open up the Moog ring modulator, I'll just use the stock settings here. I'll duplicate it over here. Here's what the ring mod effect, again, without dialing this in at all, just as an example, sounds like in this configuration where we are utilizing the effects return. And then again, if we were to mute that octave and set it up so that it's affecting everything on the direct track. Once again, a completely different tone. So really, I want you to experiment with effects returns and affecting certain parts of the signal while keeping other parts more dry, because the creative potential here is limitless. By the way, if you've made it this far in the video and you're enjoying this content, I would encourage you to hit that like button. It really helps out small channels like this. But moving on, let's get into this E-piano and a few different strategies we have for making creative use out of our effects returns. So the first thing I want to show you is reverb into delay and then delay into reverb. So right here we have this Space Designer. It's just a large and bright plate. And by itself, it's on bus 9. If I open up bus 9 right here, it sounds like this alongside the E-piano. Now I can also send from the reverb into a delay. This is a stereo delay, 220 milliseconds on the left, 180 on the right. And with the E-piano, I can also show you delay into reverb. So the delay by itself on bus 10. And then I can send the output of the delay into the reverb. It sounds like this. And then I can actually do a feedback loop. Be very careful when doing this. I'm actually going to drop the levels down quite a bit so that I'm now feeding from the dry E-piano into the delay. The delay is going into the reverb's going back into the delay. Things can get out of hand very quickly with this, so just be careful. And speaking of feedback loops, I can show you a more apt example by just using delay. I think it's a better way of actually defining these sounds. And so what I have here is a delay feedback 1, a delay feedback 2. So let's send our E-piano to bus 3. You can see that this delay is on bus 3, this delay is on bus 4, and I have the decapitator to start things off, completely obliterating the sound. And then I have some pitch shifting, so I'm actually going up a fifth, and then we have this tape delay, and the tape delay has a little bit of feedback on it. I'm actually going to take down the feedback on these two so that each delay is just a single repeat, and I'm going to turn off these processes just so that we can get a sense of this feedback right here. I'll bring these up, and again, I'm sending out of the E-piano to bus 3. Bus 3 is being sent to bus 4, and then bus 4 is being sent back and forth, so that's not so bad. If I bring up this send level to bus 3, that's not so bad either. What if we really brought these up? So you heard there that it was going to get out of control. And so that's what I mean by being careful. So let's bring in these decapitators and now make sure that we are bringing these levels down, because the decapitator is going to add a lot of gain. And here's what this can sound like. Taking advantage of that feedback, that positive feedback loop, to get an ever-growing amount of signal. If I brought this back down, the original send, we could have another listen and try to get this under control. And from there, we can actually ride these faders in and out throughout the song to make sure that we are almost applying a consistent amount, and even get into self-oscillation where we aren't going overboard and we aren't going too low either. Let's see if we can do that. I can just ride these faders so that I almost have a consistent amount of self-oscillation without ever letting it get out of control. Then eventually let it fade out. So that's a really cool effect that I haven't actually fully taken advantage of. I plan on doing something like that in one of my future tracks. And getting back to this pitch shifting right here, you can see that I have each of these going up a perfect fifth, or 7 semitones. And so if I turn both of these on, then what should happen is I'm going to send an original note from here. It's going to be pitched up a perfect fifth by the first delay right here on bus 3. Then it's going to be sent to bus 4, where it's going to be pitched up yet another fifth, and back and forth as it continues to go up in fifths. And so if I was to play a C, we should get the G above the C, followed by the D above the G, followed by the A above the D, and so on and so forth. So let's have a listen to what that can sound like. And the pitch shifter is adding a lot of artifacts. If I take off the decapitator and have another listen right here, maybe send them a little bit more level. Another cool effect that you can use, we can even alter the delay time, maybe choose 16th notes rather than 8th notes, or even do 16th notes on the first and then 8th on the next. Could sound like this. Or if I go 16ths on both. So again, virtually limitless possibilities here. In addition to feedback, we can also utilize cascading delays. So as the name might suggest, this is where we are going to send to a first delay. In this case, it's going to be on bus 11. So I'm going to send from this E piano to bus 11. Bus 11 is coming right here to this tape delay, which is being sent to bus 12, which is this tape delay, which is being sent to bus 13, which is going to this tape delay. And then I can repeat the process back and cause a feedback loop there. But just for example's sake, I'm going to turn this off. And each of these tape delays is at a quarter note. Here's what this sounds like. And I have the first mono delay panned all the way left, the second in center, and the last all the way to the right. Again, we can alter the timing to our liking. Let's maybe do an 8th dotted to start off, then maybe a quarter, then maybe let's do a half note. And so you can get really granular with these type effects and really time things out exactly how you want them. If we add a little bit of feedback to each of these, then they will repeat into themselves. And again, each repeat of Cascade 1 is going to roll into Cascade 2, is going to roll into Cascade 3. So things can get out of hand quite quickly. And then if we complete this feedback loop by sending the last cascade delay on bus 13 back into bus 11, we could get something like this. Let's add some more notes. And now I can turn off bus 11 here. And everything's going on inside this feedback loop right here. If I was to close one of these off, then it would fade out a little bit sooner. And as a last sort of general technique from which you can base all of your own creative processing off of, we can also send information to a parallel channel. So for example, bus 8 here, if I was to send this E-piano to bus 8 and then open up this decapitator, we are punishing it and the drive is all the way up. So this is going to be very distorted. You almost hear that OTT or over-the-top style compression at the end where you get a lot of that character of the release. Almost sounds tube-like. Out that send, the E-piano again. And with. So we still get that dry signal cutting through, but with a ton of character from this decapitator, a ton of distorted tone. And then from there, we could send this parallel saturation channel with this decapitator to perhaps that same cascading delay right here by sending it to bus 11. And let's complete this feedback loop. Close it. Or we could alternatively send it to any other effects return that we would like. For example, I have this stereo delay on bus 14. There's quite a bit of feedback here, and I'm only sending the distorted version of the E-piano. So that's what this could sound like. If I was to contrast that with sending just the dry signal to aux 14, it would sound like this. Versus sending just the distorted signal. Once again, versus. And so there's so much that we can do creatively with effects returns like that, whether it's feeding things back into each other or simply sending signal from one effects return to another. I would highly encourage you to experiment with this stuff on your own time and let me know in the comments below what you come up with. If there's any specific sounds that you stumble upon that you really like and you really want to share, I would love to check them out and maybe even feature them in future videos here. So again, if you liked the video, I would encourage you to hit that like button and also to subscribe here to the Mind and Microphone YouTube channel for more music production tips and techniques. There will be another video here on the end screen that I think that you would enjoy watching next if you've made it this far. So click on that one and I'll see you there. Cheers.